Julian Vance had no memory of his parents' faces. They were taken by a sickness that swept through their hollowed-out Pennsylvania mill town, leaving him with nothing but a mortgaged frame house and the echoing silence of their absence. The local librarian, a man who saw a spark of fierce intelligence in the withdrawn boy, took him in for a couple of years. But time was an unforgiving crore, and the old man's health soon failed, leaving Julian to the sterile care of the state. He learned early to be the one who handled the aftermath, the quiet arrangements for the dead. Carved his personality into something cool and detached. To him, life was a temporary state of being. Human affairs were largely inconsequential. The townspeople whispered that his brilliance was bought with the lives of those close to him, and a certain fear began to keep them at a distance. But Julian's luck turned when Alastair Finch, a renowned political historian from Georgetown enjoying a brief, eccentric tour of America's forgotten corners, heard talk of a prodigious orphan. Curiosity led Finch to the town, and what he found was a mind too sharp to be left to rust. He left with a new protégé. Finch told him that from that day forward, he would be both mentor and father to him. Alastair Finch was a scion of a Boston Brahmin family, a brilliant man sidelined by chronic illness and a distaste for the public-facing brutalities of his family's political dynasty. He never sought office himself. Instead, he poured all his knowledge, his strategic acumen, into Julian. He was profoundly satisfied with his choice of student. He once asked Julian what his ambitions were. Julian's expression was placid as he replied that he had none. Finch had sighed, telling the boy that in that case, he could fulfill a dream for him. Finch had a beloved niece, a formidable lobbyist now married into the sterling political machine, whose son, Dominic, was being groomed for a major national role. His affection for her wasn't romantic. She was simply one of the few relatives who had shown him kindness, once moving mountains to find a specialist for his ailing mother. He was certain Julian could secure a high-level position and, from there, act as a guiding hand for the second son, Dominic. Julian agreed with a simple affirmation. Finch, with a sudden flash of energy, had retorted that a simple affirmation was not enough. Julian was still young, without a single political victory to his name. If he ended up as some minor functionary, he was forbidden from ever mentioning his connection to Finch, and he should forget about advising Dominic. He should just live a quiet life, get married, and raise a family. Alastair Finch never saw that quiet life. His constitution was as fragile as his mother's had been. The day Julian's appointment as a senior advisor was announced in the national papers, Finch breathed his last. He had summoned Julian to his bedside, his voice a dry whisper. He confessed that if Julian could fulfill his request, it would make him very happy. But if Julian found his own purpose, his own cause, that would also bring him great joy. He worried over the boy's cold nature, wondering how such a detached soul would navigate the world. Finch died with that concern still clouding his eyes. Julian's ascent in Washington was meteoric. He was young, but he held a position of significant influence. The Finch family, suddenly remembering his existence, reached out with offers of alliance and support. Julian accepted their overtures but kept them at arm's length. He remembered how none of them had cared when Alastair expressed his wish to be buried on a quiet, wooded hillside rather than the ostentatious family plot. It had been Julian who hired a surveyor to find the perfect piece of land and arranged for a simple, dignified burial. It did not take long after meeting Dominic Sterling to realize the man was deeply flawed, a creature of cruel impulses and unchecked aggression. Julian often wondered if Finch, knowing the true nature of the man, would still have wanted him to serve as Dominic's guide. He thought it highly unlikely. He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment his allegiance began to shift. It was a gradual awareness, a slow turning. Suddenly, the younger Sterling son, Leo, was a constant, almost unavoidable presence. The world saw Leo as the family disgrace, a hedonistic playboy coasting on his name. Julian, however, saw something else. It was clear the world was not perceptive enough to see past the facade. But Julian was not the only one with a discerning eye. Dominic had noticed, too, and that made things complicated. When Leo had tied him up in the safe house, driven by some misguided passion, Julian felt no revulsion, no real resistance. The truly galling part was Leo's assumption, his complete misreading of the situation. He seemed to think Dominic held some sort of nefarious affection for Julian. The idea was so absurdly wrong that it almost made Julian, a man of profound composure, feel ill. Leo was put under house arrest for his transgression. Julian visited a few times, which drove Dominic into a jealous fury. He disregarded the fact that Julian was an asset cultivated for him by his own family and lashed out with undisguised violence. As the blows fell, Julian remained unervingly calm, his mind occupied with refining the phrasing of a coded message he had sent to the elder brother, Arthur, the night before. He knew then that he would not be able to fulfill Alistair Finch's wish, but he suspected his mentor, wherever he was, would be pleased. Arthur's path to securing the family's political legacy was fraught with obstacles. They had to move with caution, building their power base in secret. Arthur was the public face, the noble heir, while Julian operated from the shadows, maneuvering their pieces across the board. When the border conflict with the cartels flared up, Julian was not worried. He knew that from crisis came opportunity. It was a gamble, a trial by fire. Fortunately, a four-star general whom Leo had previously saved from political ruin played a decisive role in the conflict. Arthur's campaign was a stunning success, free of any real danger. And just as he and Julian had planned, the news that came back was of his heroic death in the line of duty. Julian sent a secure message to Arthur, stating that the plan could proceed and he should prepare to return to the capital soon. With the military's loyalty secured, there would be no further obstacles. Arthur's reply expressed his gratitude for Julian's diligence and stressed the importance of managing the situation in the capital, concluding with an urgent plea to ensure Leo's safety above all else. They needed to wait for the right moment, a time when Dominic's brutality became so public, so undeniable, that public opinion would turn against him completely. Only then could they deliver a final, decisive blow. Julian kept Leo under constant, covert surveillance, eventually bringing him to his own townhouse and securing him in a panic room, ostensibly for his protection. Later, Julian would reflect on why he never told Leo about the plan he had forged with Arthur. He supposed, subconsciously, he wanted to shield him from the ugly, violent side of their struggle. And if, by some chance, Arthur failed, Julian had an exit strategy prepared for Leo. He could spirit the younger brother, ignorant of the entire conspiracy, away to a safe, anonymous life. If Leo knew the truth, he would never stand by and watch those he loved walk into danger while he escaped to safety. But in the end, Julian discovered that Leo was far more resilient and far more intelligent than anyone had imagined. Long after, in the middle of the night, Leo awoke, his throat dry. He tried to get up for a glass of water, but his hand was held fast. Julian, asleep, was gripping it with a desperate strength, his brow furrowed in some troubled dream. He wouldn't let go. Leo couldn't help but smile, a wave of tenderness washing over him. He whispered softly, reassuring the sleeping man that he wasn't going anywhere. Julian's brow smoothed, and his eyes slowly opened. Finally freed, Leo went to the kitchen. When he returned, Julian was waiting, awake, until he was settled back in bed before closing his eyes again. His hand found Leo's once more, a silent promise that would be kept for many nights to come. Arthur had already deployed to the border. Leo was idle, but he followed his brother's instructions to keep a low profile in the city. He couldn't help much, so he resolved not to cause any trouble. One morning, before the food trucks had even begun their daily routes, he saw Julian Vance leaving the city on a powerful motorcycle. He couldn't imagine what Julian was doing, leaving the capital alone unless Dominic had assigned him some secret task. On impulse, Leo got his own bike and followed from a safe distance. They rode out past the city limits onto old country roads. The sun climbed higher, but Julian didn't stop. The landscape grew sparser, more isolated. Leo worried that Julian might spot him, but thankfully he never looked back. Finally, Julian pulled over near a small, overgrown hill and dismounted, his form quickly disappearing into the tall, wild grass. Leo scrambled to do the same, hurrying to catch up. He had lost some ground and could only see a faint shape in the distance. He prayed he wouldn't lose him now. His prayer was answered. He found Julian sitting quietly before a solitary grave. He appeared to have been there for some time. The earth before the simple headstone was dark with poured whiskey. Leo hid behind a cluster of trees, watching. The grave was untended, the stone weathered and streaked by years of wind and rain, the inscription nearly illegible. As Leo squinted, trying to make out the words, he heard Julian's low voice drift on the breeze. He spoke of how he now understood that a man must choose what he stands for and what he stands against. That a man in his position had a duty to the people to build a future for them. He hoped his mentor could forgive his defiance. He explained that, in the end, he could not fulfill the old man's final wish. After speaking, he poured another measure of whiskey onto the ground, then stood and walked back the way he had come. As Julian passed his hiding place, Leo curled into a ball, holding his breath. For a heart-stopping moment, Julian glanced toward the trees. Leo's pulse hammered in his throat. But then Julian's gaze moved on, and he walked away without a second look. Leo let out a long, shuddering breath and slowly climbed to his feet. The news from the front lines reported that Arthur Sterling was ambushed and killed in a canyon. When the official report reached the capital, their father, the senator, collapsed from the shock and grief, suspending all public duties. Leo refused to believe it. He returned to his residence in a daze, his face ashen. It wasn't possible. His brother couldn't be gone. It had to be a lie. He stumbled into the main hall, his vision blurring, nearly fainting before his chief of staff, Marcus, caught him. Marcus's voice was trembling as he insisted this was no time for despair. A secure message had arrived from Arthur's wife. The prince wasn't dead, merely missing in action. For his safety, they were reporting him as killed, but Dominic would surely make a move now. The most urgent priority was for Leo to get out of the city. He had to survive to have a chance of finding Arthur later. If he gave up, there would be truly no one left to stand for his brother. Leo's hands clenched together, forcing the swimming world back into focus. He muttered that it wasn't over, that he couldn't give up. Leaning on Marcus's arm, he gave a weak command to report that he had fallen ill. They would leave the city that night. Security in the capital tightened overnight. Though the senator was in seclusion, Dominic was already maneuvering. Leo slipped out of the city under the cover of darkness, but he was stopped at the final checkpoint on the outskirts. The inspection was too thorough. Marcus advised that they should hide and wait for a few days. But the news that came wasn't of relaxed security. It was that the senator had died, and Dominic Sterling had assumed control. Leo was stunned. His father hadn't been that ill when he left. Dominic must have killed him. He had gone completely mad. But there was no time for grief. Marcus reported that they couldn't wait any longer. He had made arrangements with a local farmer. The next day, Leo could be smuggled out with a shipment of produce, though it would mean hiding in the back of a truck. Leo waved off the concern, remarking with a hollow laugh that at a time like this, such discomforts were irrelevant. Marcus seemed relieved. He advised Leo to get some rest. Just before he left, Leo called out his name. Marcus turned back. Leo asked if, after all these years serving a powerless son, he had ever felt regret. He heard Marcus chuckle softly, saying he thought they were beyond such questions. He reminded Leo that if he hadn't been pulled from a back alley years ago, he'd be buried in an unmarked grave. He owed his life to Leo. Regret was not a word in his vocabulary. His final words were a plea for Leo to be careful once he was clear of the city. Before dawn, Leo was burrowed under a pile of rough burlap sacks in the back of the truck, the smell of potatoes and damp earth filling his lungs. It was the first time he had ever hidden in such a place, and he wondered how many more times his future would demand it. The ride was bumpy, but his mind was calm. He knew he had a long road ahead. The truck rumbled up to the checkpoint and was stopped. The farmer showed his credentials and began a rambling story about his destination and business. The federal agent, impatient, poked at the sacks with a baton a few times before waving them through. Leo held his breath, a small spark of hope igniting within him. It was the first piece of good news in days. The truck continued on, and once out of sight of the checkpoint, pulled over at a prearranged spot. The farmer called out that they had arrived. Leo pushed aside the sacks, ready to jump out, when the sound of approaching vehicles made them both turn in alarm. A man in a perfectly tailored suit sat astride a powerful motorcycle, his expression severe, flanked by two black SUVs. His voice was cold and merciless as he gave the order to take him. In the next moment, agents swarmed the truck. Leo stared at Julian Vance, watching them advance, his mind a complete blank. The farmer, terrified, scrambled back into his truck and sped away. But Leo knew, with Julian here, there was no escape. He would never find his brother now. Just moments ago, elation and hope had filled him as they cleared the checkpoint. Now, in an instant, it was all shattered. A great wave of disbelief and helplessness washed over him, and the world went dark. When he woke, his hands were bound. He opened his eyes to a dimly lit room, furnished with the understated luxury of an old-money residence. Felt like a panic room. The cuff of a white shirt was in his field of vision. He tried to speak, his voice a dry rasp. Before he could form a word, a cool hand touched his forehead. He flinched, and in the next instant, a silk tie was fastened over his eyes, plunging him into a deeper darkness. His other senses sharpened. He heard Julian's voice, smooth and cool as ever, yet deeply unsettling. He asked if the situation felt at all familiar, and if it compared favorably to Leo's own previous efforts. Julian kept him there. At first, Leo suspected he would be interrogated, but Julian only came each day to chat about trivial matters. He had never seen a prisoner treated so well, with good food, fine drink, and comfortable lodging. The only restriction was that he couldn't leave. He wondered if Dominic, knowing what Leo had done to Julian, had handed him over to his favorite advisor as a form of revenge. And Julian, being a man of integrity, had no taste for torture and simply confined him. So he was getting off easy. But he couldn't afford to be lulled into this gentle captivity. He still had to find his brother. But Julian had him locked down tight. How could he possibly escape? He was lost in thought and didn't notice Julian enter with a tray until the soft clink of china on the table startled him. He looked up to see Julian watching him intently. He asked what was on his mind. Leo just shook his head and obediently began to eat. When he was finished, Julian, his face a placid mask, pushed a bowl of dark liquid toward him. He told him to drink it. Leo was confused, asking if it was medicine, as he wasn't sick. Julian explained that it was a tonic for physical exhaustion, and remarked that he seemed to have a taste for it. A tonic for exhaustion. Leo looked up at him, bewildered, only to see a rare, playful glint in Julian's eyes. A slight curve touched his lips, a sight as startling and beautiful as a desert in bloom. The sight was intoxicating, and Leo, without another thought, drained the bowl. Days bled into one another, and Leo's anxiety grew. He didn't know what was happening in the outside world, or if his brother had been found. He was desperate for news. But Julian was preternaturally cautious, his intellect almost unnerving. Every attempt Leo made to probe for an escape route was deftly and silently countered. Just as he was reaching a fever pitch of desperation, an opportunity presented itself. That evening, Julian arrived with a bottle of bourbon, a rare occurrence. He rarely allowed Leo alcohol during his confinement, stating a dislike for habitual drunkenness. But tonight, he said, was an exception. He announced that the next day was Leo's birthday, and for one night he could indulge. Julian sat at the table, poured 2 glasses and passed one to Leo. Leo asked if he was drinking as well, remembering that the next day was a workday. Julian, who normally abstained from alcohol and maintained a rigid schedule, seemed indifferent. He replied vaguely that he wasn't going to the office tomorrow. Leo sipped his drink. The bourbon was excellent, rich and smoky, just to his taste, but incredibly strong. He glanced up and saw a flush creeping up Julian's cheeks. He tested the waters, saying his name. Julian, seeming to pull himself back from a haze, set his glass down and asked what he wanted. But as he did, his hand trembled slightly. Leo shook his head, claiming it was nothing, while a plan began to form in his mind. Julian was not invincible. His weakness was alcohol. He quietly refilled Julian's glass. He told him that since he was the only person with him for his birthday, he had to drink with him properly. Julian's eyes were already losing focus, but he managed a solemn nod of agreement. Leo couldn't help but smile. He told him he had to keep his word. The consequence of keeping his word was Julian, head propped on his hand, falling asleep at the table. It was an uncomfortable position, but he seemed dead to the world. Leo called his name several times with no response. His heart pounded as he checked the door. It was locked, as expected when Julian entered. But the key had to be on him. He returned to the table and carefully began to search Julian's pockets. The movement seemed to disturb him. Julian shifted, murmuring Leo's name in his sleep, and leaned against him. Leo froze, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin, terrified he would wake. But he was deeply intoxicated. Even unconscious, Julian possessed a disheveled, artistic beauty. Leo's fingers closed around the key. He looked at Julian, still leaning against him without any defense, and a pang of guilt struck him. Julian had come to celebrate his birthday, and here he was, planning to betray that kindness and escape. He gently traced the line of Julian's face, the strong nose, the thin lips. He couldn't stay. They were on opposite sides. If only he hadn't pledged his loyalty to Dominic. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath to steady himself, and then spoke in a soft, coaxing voice, telling Julian he would help him to the bed. Julian complied without waking, and Leo settled him onto the mattress, where he fell into a deeper sleep. He was still sleeping soundly when Leo let himself out of the room. It took some time to get out of the townhouse, and once on the street, he felt a wave of uncertainty. Where should he go? How would he get out of the city? How could he find his brother? But doing nothing would achieve nothing. The streets of the capital were dark in places. He used the moon to navigate, planning to head toward the city gates. They wouldn't open at night, but he could try to blend in with the morning traffic. If Julian didn't catch him first. He walked through familiar streets, but the city had changed in just a few months. The once bustling night markets were desolate. The vibrant clubs and bars, which once stayed open all night, were dark and shuttered. He passed a row house and heard the sounds of weeping from within. A sharp pain seized his chest. Was this the city under Dominic's rule? It was worse than he had imagined. He found himself by the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool, the sight stirring old memories. When he was young, his father had been less strict. The children were allowed supervised outings for major holidays. That ended the year he was 12, after his brother was almost hurt at the Festival of Lights. After that, they rarely left the family compound until they were old enough to have their own residences. And the incident with his brother had happened right here, instigated by Dominic. He clenched his fists, about to turn away, when a voice called out from the edge of the pool. He was asked who he was. The man was dressed in black, and Leo hadn't even seen him in the shadows. He had no intention of answering. A man standing alone by the water this late was either a drunk or a transient. He started to walk away, but the man pursued him, grabbing his shoulder. At the same time, Leo demanded to know what he was doing, and the man sneered about a commoner daring to touch him. Their eyes met and both fell silent. Dominic. What was he doing here? A cruel smile spread across Dominic's face, his grip tightening until Leo thought his bones would break. Dominic hissed that Leo wasn't dead. He knew it. Heaven was on his side. Leo shoved him away and ran. He cursed his luck. But he was no match for Dominic, who had been trained in combat his whole life, not to mention the security detail that was surely lurking nearby. A sharp blow to the back of his neck, and everything went black. He woke up in a secure room again. This time it wasn't a townhouse, but somewhere inside the Capitol building. He thought with a grim sense of humor that everyone seemed to have a fondness for secret rooms. A steel cuff was locked around his left wrist, chained to a structural pillar. Dominic sat opposite him, drinking calmly, a smile on his face. It seemed he wasn't planning to kill him immediately. The sight of Dominic filled Leo with a rage he couldn't suppress. But he knew he was even more powerless here than he had been with Julian. He had never understood this cruel, violent older brother. Dominic set down his glass, raising an eyebrow. He said that since taking power, the happiest moment he'd had was discovering tonight that Leo was alive. Leo scowled, confused by his insane ramblings. He spat that Dominic, a patricidal usurper, dared to speak of power. He didn't care if Dominic killed him. A quick death was better than being his captive. His words only made Dominic laugh. He agreed that he had killed their father and asked so what? He challenged Leo to consider if their situations were reversed. If he had died on the battlefield, would their precious, honorable Arthur have let such a golden opportunity pass? Leo violently kicked over the table between them, rising to his feet and shouting that Dominic wasn't fit to be mentioned in the same breath as his brother. He was a traitor, disloyal, and dishonorable. Heaven had been blind to let him succeed. Dominic's eyes narrowed, his expression turning cold. He said he should have drowned Arthur in the reflecting pool all those years ago. It would have saved everyone a lot of trouble. Leo looked away in disgust. He told Dominic he was an irredeemable monster. His only regret was that as a child, he had once truly thought of him as a brother. When he was 7, their mother had abdicated her public role, retreating to a convent. He didn't understand then, only that she had gone away and would see no one but Arthur. The staff whispered that the younger son had broken her heart, that after being hurt by the senator, she had pinned all her hopes on her children, only to be disappointed again. The staff were less discreet when they thought he couldn't hear. It hurt and he didn't know why. Arthur, sensing his distress, tried to protect him, but as the heir, his schedule was demanding. Most of the time, Leo was alone, hiding in quiet corners of the estate. That was when he met Dominic, who was just as isolated. Dominic was the son of the senator's second wife, the most striking of all the children, and the most overlooked. Leo, naturally outgoing, thought he'd found a kindred spirit and tried to befriend him. Dominic was resistant at first, but Leo's persistence wore him down. Their friendship ended the year he was 12. Arthur had managed to get away from his duties to take him to the Festival of Lights, and Leo, overjoyed, had canceled his plans with Dominic. Somehow, during the festival, Dominic had lured Arthur's security away and pushed him into the reflecting pool. Even then, his strength was formidable. He held Arthur under the water, preventing him from surfacing. If Leo hadn't arrived just then and screamed, he might not have stopped. After that, he cut all ties with Dominic. The memory faded. He saw the shards of the broken table service on the floor. Without hesitation, he grabbed a sharp piece and lunged at Dominic. He managed only a shallow cut before he was overpowered and slammed against the wall, his back exploding in pain. Dominic pressed the shard against his forehead, his eyes glinting with a savage amusement. He asked Leo if he knew why he had attacked Arthur that day at the festival. As he spoke, the sound of rain began to beat against the building.
À soudaine, violente.
See, thunderstorm. Ignoring the storm and Leo's furious glare, Dominic continued. He explained that he was sick of Leo always putting his brother first, sick of hearing how wonderful Arthur was, sick of being abandoned for him. Leo looked at him with contempt, asking if that was it. Jealousy? Because Leo had a real brother and he didn't? With a loud bang, Dominic slammed his fist into the wall next to Leo's head. He sneered, asking if Leo was pretending to be stupid, or if he really didn't understand. He offered more information. When Leo was under house arrest, Dominic had summoned Julian to his office and had him beaten severely. His back was a ruin of bloody flesh. By the time Leo was released, the wounds had healed, and he never saw the evidence. He then revealed that the next day was Leo's birthday. He had thought him dead and had declared a day of mourning. He had gone to the reflecting pool to remember him, only to find him there, alive. It was a miracle. The rain fell harder, and a deep roll of thunder shook the building. Leo just stared at Dominic, slowly shaking his head, his lips white. He reminded him they were brothers. Dominic laughed. He was the most powerful man in the country. He was already damned as a murderer and a tyrant. What was one more sin? He pushed Leo hard against the wall. He was a lunatic, a complete madman, unfit to lead, and now coveting his own family. Dominic ignored his curses, pinning him down, his hands tearing at Leo's shirt despite his desperate struggles. Suddenly, a frantic banging came from outside the door. A guard was shouting that there was an emergency. Dominic roared for them to go away, but the banging grew more urgent, then stopped abruptly. Something was wrong. Dominic released Leo, grabbed a decorative sword from a display case, and went to the door. The door wasn't opened. It was splintered apart by a single powerful blow. Lightning flashed, illuminating the figure standing in the doorway. It was Julian. He was soaked to the skin, his hair plastered to his forehead, but he held a gleaming silver sword, its cold light matching the ice in his eyes. In that instant, Dominic understood everything. He sneered that Julian had played his part well enough to fool even him. He now realized why the supposedly dead Leo had suddenly appeared in the city. Julian must have been hiding him all along. He mocked Julian for daring to come alone, asking if he was eager to die. He raised his own sword to strike. Leo screamed for him to stop. Julian couldn't beat Dominic. Dominic was a trained fighter. He saw Julian's gaze, which had been fixed on him since the door broke. He understood now. The confinement had been for his protection. His escape must have thrown all their plans into chaos. Tears streamed down his face. He felt a surge of regret. He had already lost one brother. Was he about to watch Julian die, too? He struggled against the chain, pulling it taut, unable to move closer. Dominic's sword swung toward Julian, but another blade intercepted it with a clang. A familiar, confident laugh came from behind Julian. Leo looked up in disbelief as his brother, Arthur, stepped out of the shadows. Behind him were his wife, the 4-star general, and a squad of elite soldiers. They surrounded Dominic, their weapons ready. Arthur stood with his hands behind his back, his expression coolly triumphant. He told Dominic that by hiding in his bunker, he had missed all the news. The takeover had been remarkably smooth. He had planned to wait a few more days, he said, his eyes hardening. But when Dominic dared to touch Leo, his time had run out. In contrast, Julian seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding around him. He walked straight to Leo, an avenging angel descending to earth, his face an emotionless mask. He swung his sword, and the chain fell away. Leo's tears flowed freely. He was sorry. He didn't know he and Arthur were working together. He was sorry for messing up their plans. He tried to say more, but Julian pulled him into a fierce embrace. His body was cold from the rain, but Leo felt a warmth and relief he had never known. Julian's voice was low and unsteady. He said that Leo had done well enough. It was his fault for not telling him. He should have told him. He held him tightly, as if to reassure himself that Leo was real and safe, his head resting on Leo's shoulder. His voice, when he spoke again, was choked with an emotion Leo had never heard from him before. He asked if Leo could imagine what he felt when he woke up and found him gone. He had never been afraid of anything like that before. He confessed that Leo was the first person to ever make him lose his composure. A fresh wave of tears stung Leo's eyes. His own hot tears fell on Julian's cool, rain-slicked skin. He promised he would never do it again. He was so happy to see him. Julian's voice was steady again, but with a new, dark undercurrent. He said it was all right, because no matter what, Leo would never be far from him again. He would not give him a second chance to leave. In his most reckless year, Leo had kidnapped his brother's political rival. He held him in a private safe house, bound and at his mercy for 3 days and 3 nights. Exhausted and unable to continue, he let him go, and they became strangers. Later, when his brother's career collapsed and he became a fugitive, Leo fled in panic, trying to sneak out of the capital in the back of a truck. He was intercepted by troops led by that same man, Julian Vance. In the sunless, secure room, Julian tied a silk blindfold over his eyes. His voice as cool and unsettling as polished marble. He asked the young prince if the situation felt at all familiar. The annual leadership retreat at the Blackwood Grove was tomorrow. The nation's most powerful figures would gather at the exclusive hunting lodge. Banners would fly, rifles would crack, and political careers would be made or broken. But Leo had received intelligence that Julian Vance, the formidable senior advisor, planned to use the event to present evidence implicating his brother, Arthur. Their father, the aging patriarch of the Sterling dynasty, had grown paranoid in his later years, deeply suspicious of his own sons, especially the heir apparent. He kept tight control of the family's security forces, trusting only a few loyalists. But last month, a 4-star general was accused by Dominic of having back-channel dealings with a rival political faction. Their father was furious and ordered the general brought in for questioning. But the man was one of Arthur's key allies. Arthur had sent and the general had vanished into a secure hideout. To the public, he was a fugitive. But Julian had found him. He had detained the general's family and discovered encrypted messages confirming his location. Leo's own people had been too late to intervene. The family was gone, spirited away to a secret location by Julian, who was waiting for the retreat to spring his trap. His chief of staff, Marcus, was deeply concerned. He pointed out that if Arthur fell, they would be next. He suggested they inform Arthur immediately, have him feign illness to miss the retreat, and use the time to find the general's family. As long as they found them before Julian made his move, they would be fine. Leo waved a dismissive hand. Time was too short. It was too risky. He stood, gazing at the autumn colors in the courtyard. He had another idea. The world knew him as the indulged, reckless son. A little outrageous behavior would surprise no one. Marcus paled, beginning to protest, but Leo cut him off. He gave them 3 days. They were to tear the city apart if they had to, find the family, and destroy the messages. The night before the retreat, Julian Vance was leaving his office when Leo's car cut him off. He announced that he and the esteemed advisor had an engagement for drinks. Julian's colleagues were puzzled but dared not question the senator's son. Dragged into the car, Julian's face was a thunderous mask, yet he remained composed. His cool, almond-shaped eyes, framed by dark lashes, glanced at Leo with an icy disdain that, perversely, Leo found captivating. He asked what business the prince had with him. The voice was so crisp, so easy to imagine breaking. Leo swallowed, forcing a flirtatious smile. The whole capital knew of his preference for men, and Julian was no exception. Julian turned away in disgust, but Leo continued, saying his business was of a more intimate nature. Julian whipped his head back in shock, just as a chloroform-soaked cloth was pressed over his face. Before he could say another word, he slumped against the seat. When he woke, they were in a secure room at Leo's private estate outside the city. Julian's wrists were bound, his shirt half unbuttoned, His eyes were cold steel. He demanded to know what Leo thought he was doing, asking if this was an attempt on the life of a public official. Leo reached out and touched his cheek. His skin was unnaturally warm. He assured him he had no intention of killing him. No one knew that he had been obsessed with Julian Vance for years. From the day Julian first came to D.C., a brilliant outsider cutting through the city's entrenched power structures, Leo had watched him from afar, captivated by his cool intelligence. He knew he was a mess, that his reputation was toxic, and he had intended to admire him from a distance. But now, he grabbed Julian's collar, his voice filled with fury. He demanded to know why he was working for Dominic. What was so great about that violent, sadistic animal who treated people like disposable toys? He and Arthur were full brothers. Their mother had long ago retreated from public life, leaving them without a powerful matriarch or a strong faction of support. They had survived the political storms only by relying on each other. Now Arthur and Dominic were locked in a battle for their father's legacy. Leo admitted his motives weren't entirely pure, but he couldn't stand by and watch Julian hand his brother's life over to Dominic. He challenged him, asking if he, the supposed paragon of integrity, was really going to back a man like that. If Dominic took over, it would be a disaster for everyone. Julian listened, a humorless smile playing on his lips. His voice was raw when he spoke. He asked Leo who, then, he should support. If Leo truly possessed such noble ideals, why was he resorting to kidnapping and assault? He accused Leo of drugging him. The more he spoke, the hoarser his voice became, and a deep flush spread across his face and neck. The evidence of the drug's effect was becoming undeniable beneath his disheveled clothes. Still, he pressed his attack. He said that given the circumstances, it hardly mattered who he worked for. Leo's eyes reddened. He tightened his grip, shouting, asking if Julian knew what the men in his family were really like. Did he think Dominic only wanted his mind? Their father had his own appetites. Did Julian think the way Dominic looked at him was professional? The interns in Dominic's office were replaced every month. He dared Julian to find out how many of them left with their sanity intact. Hearing this, Julian closed his eyes and let out a soft, contemptuous laugh, as if he didn't believe a word. Leo's control snapped. He tore at his own clothes, and over Julian's venomous glare, he leaned in close, his lips near his ear. He whispered that it might as well be him. If someone was going to have his body, he was a much better option. For 3 days and 3 nights, Julian was held in that room. Meals were brought to the door by a silent servant. On the second night, feeling drained, Leo slipped back into the city to see a discreet doctor for a restorative tonic and to get an update from Marcus. He was told they hadn't found the family yet, but they had strong leads and were confident they would be secured by the next day. He was warned to be careful. Once the retreat was over, the senator would surely order a search for the missing advisor. Leo assured him he had a plan. He returned to the estate with the medicine. When he entered the room, Julian was lying on the bed, eyes closed, his expression a mask of cold indifference. His wrists were still bound, the chain short enough to prevent escape. He seemed to have resigned himself to his fate. Leo drank some of the tonic. Then, with a gesture of consideration, he brought the bowl to Julian's lips, urging him to drink. The movement startled Julian awake. A sharp, hostile light flashed in his eyes as he turned his head away violently. The bowl nearly spilled. His voice was like ice, laced with fury, as he ordered Leo to take his disgusting drugs away. Leo felt a pang of hurt. He protested that it wasn't that kind of drug, and besides, he had only used it once. This was just a tonic for exhaustion. But Julian's aura only grew colder. He turned his face away completely, refusing to engage. Leo shrugged, saying he'd drink it himself then. On the evening of the third day, Marcus sent word that everything was taken care of. With a heavy heart, Leo went back to the room. Julian had eaten and was sleeping deeply. Leo had put something in his food, so he wasn't worried about him waking. He gently cleaned his face and dressed him. Then he carried him to the car. The driver had instructions to leave him at the front gate of his own residence. As for Leo, he turned to an aide and told him to find 2 thick branches. He had to go see his father that night. By the time he arrived at the family estate, the dinner was over. He figured Arthur was already back at his own home. He had sent him a note that afternoon with a brief explanation of the past few days. A senior staffer led him through the halls, chattering about how much the senator had missed him during the retreat. Leo managed a weak smile. He was the son who most resembled his father, both in looks and in his appetites, and he posed no political threat. His father's affection for him was like that for a favorite pet. Still, it was a weakness he could exploit. He felt the rough bark of the branches tucked into his belt and took a deep breath before entering the main study. He bowed, announcing his presence. The dinner had ended, but Dominic was still there. A knot of dread formed in Leo's stomach. With Dominic present, his plan was in jeopardy. The 2 men were in good spirits. His father waved him up, a smile on his face, and asked where he had been hiding during the retreat. Leo kept his head bowed. He stammered that he wouldn't dare say. The room fell silent. He could feel Dominic's gaze on him, slick and venomous like a snake. Dominic walked over, reached for his belt, and pulled out the branches. Leo's eyes widened as he tried to stop him, but Dominic held him back. He held the branches up for their father to see, a cold smile on his lips. He announced that their little brother had come bearing a switch, as if to beg for punishment. His father's expression was unreadable. He simply asked what crime Leo wished to confess. At that, Leo knelt properly. He said that, in a moment of foolishness, he had detained a public official. He had only wanted to have a drink, but the man had refused, and in a fit of pique, he had locked him up for a few days. He risked a glance at his father. His expression seemed stable. It was Dominic whose face was dark with rage. Reassured, Leo lowered his eyes again. But in the next second, a ceramic mug flew past his head, shattering against the wall. A cold sweat broke over him. Another inch to the right and he would be bleeding. His father's voice was a low growl, demanding to know which official the bastard son had dared to touch. Leo knew this was the moment of truth. He had been 70% certain he wouldn't be seriously punished. After all, his father had his own history of scandalous affairs, long since scrubbed from the official record by intimidated historians. He had always turned a blind eye to Leo's own transgressions. Taking a breath, he prepared to say Julian's name, but Dominic beat him to it. He asked who else it could be but senior advisor Julian Vance, who was conspicuously absent from the retreat. He looked at Leo, his eyes glowing with red-hot hatred, as if he wanted to tear him limb from limb. Of course, he had forgotten about Dominic. He had touched his prize. Dominic would certainly fan the flames. Leo gritted his teeth and pressed his forehead to the pristine floor, squeezing out a tear or two. He confirmed it was Julian Vance. He claimed he was overcome with emotion and had acted rashly, and that he would accept any punishment his father saw fit. His father said nothing, but he didn't throw anything else. It was Dominic who couldn't contain himself. He took one of the branches and held it over Leo, looking down at him with a beautiful, sinister smile. He suggested they cripple him, cut his tendons and lock him away forever so he couldn't cause any more trouble. The vicious little man. Leo was furious, but he knew this was his chance. His father hated it when his children overstepped their bounds, his paranoia growing with age. Whatever Leo had done, it was not Dominic's place to decide the punishment. Leo looked pleadingly at his father, his eyes wide and tearful, silently begging him to intervene. As expected, his father's expression shifted. He asked Dominic if he intended to administer punishment on his behalf. Dominic realized his mistake and immediately knelt to apologize. His father rubbed his temples, his voice weary and annoyed, and told him to get out. Dominic, resentful but obedient, stood and deliberately bumped into Leo on his way out. Then his father's gaze fell on Leo. His brow was furrowed as he told him to get out as well. He called him a worthless disgrace and ordered the guards to give him 20 strokes and confine him to his residence for 6 months. Leo scrambled out of the room, relief washing over him. The punishment, while painful, was survivable. It would keep him out of commission for a few months, which would cover the period of his house arrest. It was a good outcome. The confinement was boring. His father forbade visitors, so he spent his days lying in bed, recovering. But Arthur still came, sneaking in under the cover of night. The first time, he avoided the guards and tapped on the window. 3 short, 2 long. It was their childhood signal. Leo opened it a crack, and Arthur reached in to stroke his hair, asking if it hurt. Leo shook his head, then remembered he couldn't be seen and said it was much better now. Arthur was silent for a long moment before sighing heavily, saying he had failed to protect him. Leo could picture his brother's expression perfectly. Guilt, pain, regret. He had always been the strong, gentle protector. Leo told him he was grown now and couldn't always rely on him. Between them, such words were unnecessary. In this city, they were the only true family each other had. Arthur visited several more times over the next 6 months. Sometimes, Leo would wake in the night and see a shadow at his window, which would retreat after he called out, as if not wanting to disturb his sleep. Occasionally, he thought of Julian Vance. When his confinement ended, Julian would surely avoid him even more diligently. The thought brought a mix of sadness and guilt. It was for the best for both of them. The official who came to release him was Julian Vance. It was likely his father's way of reminding Julian to keep silent about what had happened. The story of the kidnapping never got out. People just assumed Leo had done something to annoy his father. Julian was as cold as ever, and Leo didn't know what to say, so the ride was silent. But by chance, Arthur had also come to meet him, providing an escape from Julian's freezing presence. Arthur grinned when he saw him, remarking that he looked like he'd put on some weight. Startled, Leo quickly checked his waistline, relieved to find it unchanged. 6 months without riding or training had probably softened him, but it wasn't too bad. It was a normal, lighthearted exchange between brothers, but for some reason, it seemed to offend Julian. He shot Leo a sideways glance, muttered something about indecency under his breath, and stalked off. Leo was baffled. What had he done to offend him now? Why did he hate him so much? But then, he supposed anyone would want to kill the person who had kidnapped them. Arthur just shook his head with a knowing look and clapped him on the shoulder, saying he'd had food prepared and they should eat first. After his release, Leo made a point of avoiding any event where Julian would be present. He was sure Julian understood his intention. One day after a meeting, the clasp on his watch broke and it fell to the floor. As he turned to retrieve it, he saw a tall, elegant figure standing there. It was Julian Vance. The severe lines of his suit, which made other men look swallowed by fabric, only accentuated his lean, powerful frame. His expression was cool as he held out the watch, his gaze unreadable. He informed him that he had dropped it. Leo froze, then took a step back, waving his hands dismissively. He said it was fine, he didn't want it anymore, and hurried away without looking back. Since the incident, Arthur had become even more protective, assigning him additional security. But even though Leo had stopped Julian's exposé, Arthur's position was still precarious. Dominic's faction was powerful, and the struggle for succession was far from over. His efforts to avoid Julian had made him seem unusually well-behaved. He turned down invitations from his usual crowd for nights of debauchery. However, Marcus recently reported that a popular nightclub in the city was suspected of being a front for Dominic, used to pass information and procure victims for his appetites. If they could find concrete evidence, it would be a major blow. Leo leaned back in his chair and instructed an aide to call the youngest son of the Songmeyer family. He and the boy were going to the Moonlight Lounge tonight. On the way there, Leo's friend, Ian Songmeyer, chattered nonstop. He wanted to know why Leo was suddenly asking him out for drinks after being a ghost for so long. He'd heard rumors that Leo had a secret lover hidden away. He also pointed out that the Moonlight Lounge was known for its female entertainers, not exactly Leo's usual preference. Leo shot him an irritated look, asking if he couldn't just want a drink. He told him to stop spreading ridiculous rumors. His last attempt at hiding someone for 3 days had earned him 6 months of house arrest. Inside the club, Ian immediately took charge, calling over the manager and demanding their best performers. Given their status, the manager complied, and soon a troupe of dancers filled their private booth. Leo had little interest in the performance. After a while, he signaled to Ian that he was stepping out. Ian, his eyes glued to the lead dancer, didn't even notice. Leo rolled his eyes and left. The club looked ordinary enough, with no obvious signs of illicit activity. He wasn't expecting to find anything on his first visit. He would have to come back several times, build a rapport, and then look for an opportunity to investigate more thoroughly. He got his own room, ordered food and a bottle of scotch, and dismissed the offered entertainment. The music from Ian's booth was too loud anyway. The scotch was good. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. He drank more than he intended, and a pleasant warmth spread through him. Feeling drowsy, he loosened his collar and lay down on a nearby sofa to rest, figuring Ian would find him when he was ready to leave. When he opened his eyes, his body felt heavy. The music from the other rooms had stopped. He rubbed his temples. He didn't think the Moonlight Lounge ever closed. As he became more alert, he realized his clothes were in disarray. His jacket was on the floor, his shirt unbuttoned. He sat up, furious. He had an exceptionally still way of sleeping. This wasn't his doing. He shouted for whoever had undressed him while he slept to show themselves. As his anger peaked, the door opened. He glared, ready to attack, but the person who entered was Julian Vance. His anger instantly evaporated, replaced by the flustered feeling of being caught doing something wrong. He scrambled to put on his jacket. He asked what Julian was doing here. Julian's face was impassive, his tone all business. He informed the prince that he was acting on official orders to shut down the Moonlight Lounge and detain anyone in violation of federal law. He advised that if the prince had no other business, he should leave promptly. Leo nodded and followed Julian out, fumbling with his clothes. A few steps down the hall, they ran into Ian, who immediately hid behind Leo, his eyes wide with fear. He asked if Leo had also been caught in the middle of things. Leo scowled, telling him not to be ridiculous. He had just fallen asleep. He asked what had happened. Ian, on the verge of tears, explained that he had been enjoying himself when federal agents swarmed the place, ordering everyone out of their rooms while they conducted a search. He had been made to wait outside for a long time, but Leo had slept through it all, undisturbed. He supposed they were afraid to wake a Sterling. He then asked Ian if he had seen anyone enter his room. He still couldn't believe he could have gotten so disheveled on his own. Before Ian could answer, Julian's cold voice cut in from ahead of them. He said that he had entered. Leo was speechless. He knew that. He wasn't asking about him. Ian was confused, but Leo just waved his hand and said it was nothing. Later that night, as he undressed for bed, he caught a glimpse of a small red mark on the back of his neck in the mirror, like an insect bite. Looking closer, he found a faint bruise on his side as well. He touched his neck, muttering about aggressive mosquitoes. He made a mental note to have someone spray for bugs tomorrow. The border conflict flared up again. This time it was a secessionist militia, the same group that had caused trouble a decade ago. Their fighters were ruthless and well-equipped, and the last conflict had been costly. Normally, Dominic would be sent to handle such a situation. As much as Leo despised him, Dominic was an effective military commander. And with him gone from the capital, it would be a golden opportunity for Arthur. But when the official orders came down a few days later, it wasn't Dominic leading the operation. It was Arthur, the heir apparent. It was already night when Marcus told him the news. Leo didn't care. He went straight to Arthur's residence. Arthur wasn't surprised to see him. There was a gentle sadness in his eyes. Leo stood before him, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Every word was filled with resentment. He demanded to know why it had to be him, especially now. It was always Dominic who handled these things. The militia was dangerous. If Dominic were gone, they might have had a chance. He didn't want him to go. Tears started to fall, and he covered his face, hating his own powerlessness. He had never been able to do anything. Arthur's voice was soft as he placed a hand on his shoulder. He told Leo to have faith in him. The militia was dangerous, but he was not an incompetent leader. Besides, he said, turning to look out at the dark night, sometimes a setback could be a blessing in disguise. He announced that his wife, who came from a military family, would be going with him. That wasn't surprising. But then Arthur said that his biggest concern wasn't the fighting, but leaving Leo alone in the capital. He had considered taking him along, but decided it was safer for him to stay. He warned him to be careful of Dominic. Leo fought back his tears and said he understood. Arthur stroked his hair. He told him it was late and he should go home to sleep. Then he smiled, adding that if he wanted to stay the night, he would have a room prepared.